WT Live, Monday night, 9 Eastern on CNN.
Joining us now, two members of the House of Representatives leadership, Democrat James Clyburn of South Carolina and Republican Mike Pence of Indiana. Congressman Clyburn, let me begin with you. Blistering editorial in the New York Times today accusing the president of not showing enough leadership on the oil spill. We also have Maureen Dowd, another friendly sort of Obama person, taking him to task. What is the president doing wrong here that's getting critiques not just from conservatives but from his base, basically?
Well, I don't know that the president is doing anything wrong. I think that the president's style is something that a lot of people feel very comfortable with during the campaign. They were looking for a steady hand. They were looking for someone who was intellectually capable of understanding all of the nuances of various issues. But when it came time for governing, people like to see a little more emotional involvement on the part of their leaders.
But if I could just ask you, sir, just because the New York Times editorial wasn't talking about he needs to emote more. They were talking about leadership. And there's not a lot of nuance to oil coming up from the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. What they question is he has not taken hold of this and shown leadership. You don't agree with that assessment?
No, I don't. I really believe that when you have so many entities involved in this, then it becomes a problem of trying to get everybody onto the same page and focus onto a process that seems sometimes to be contradictory if you go from one agency to another. If this were only one or two agencies involved in this process, that would be one thing. But there must be 12, 14, almost 20 entities involved, and so managing that gets clumsy sometimes. But I do believe that the president is much more hands-on at this point than he was at the beginning. I don't think any of us knew the real extent of the spill, because we were getting information from BP that now we found out was not quite true. In fact, was far.
Let me bring Congressman Pence into this. I remember in Katrina, some of the first complaints about the president was when the administration said we didn't know it was this bad, and it wasn't really a fairly good excuse for a lot of people because it was fairly obvious. How do you judge how the administration has been doing, and does it fit? I mean, I'm going to anticipate you think he hasn't done as well as Congressman Clyburn thinks.
Well, yeah, I think I respect Jim's opinion on this, but this is not a matter of the president's style. It's not a matter of public relations. This administration did not send cabinet-level officials to the region until 10 days after the explosion occurred. It would be 2 weeks after the explosion occurred that we began to hear from members of Congress from the region, that you literally had fishermen standing on docks. You had parish presidents who were waiting for BP to give them permission to go out and deploy boom to protect their wetlands and their coastline. Then we began to hear from Governor Bobby Jindal about a delay in permitting for the construction of barrier islands. I think what's become clear to people at every end of the political spectrum, and now even on the editorial pages of the New York Times, is that this administration was slow to respond and continues to fail to provide the kind of energetic leadership that the American people expect, and Candy, that the law demands. That under the Oil Pollution Act that was adopted after the Exxon Valdez disaster, it says that the President of the United States shall develop a plan to contain the discharge. I mean, I read this morning in the news.
He has, in fact, he's been down there. He's been looking over it. He put Thad Allen down there and said, "Here's my point guy."
Right.
He can't plug the leak. He can't clean up the oil. He tells his people to do it. Why isn't that sufficient?
Well, but he could have picked up the phone and called the CEO of BP sooner than 50 days. I'm glad he's meeting with the chairman of BP next week. But I think the fact that he never spoke to the CEO of British Petroleum for the first 50 days of this incident is emblematic of the kind of detached style of leadership that we're seeing here. Look, and this business about the president looking for somebody's ASS to kick this week, you know, as the New York Times said this morning, I think everybody in America knew on day 2 whose AWS ought to be kicked. The reality is that BP is responsible to plug that hole. BP is financially responsible to contain the impacts of the discharge on the coast and on the economy. But that's our coastline, and the president should be marshaling every resource of this country, every resource available around the world to spare our coastline and to spare the families in the region the extent of the impact of this spill.
Congressman Clyburn, CNN is reporting now that the president, in his Wednesday meeting with BP executives that Congressman Pence just referred to, will say that he wants an escrow fund. He wants BP to fund it. He wants that to be ruled, if you will, or run by a third party that will decide who gets what sort of compensation for what damage. Does that sound like a good idea? Because there had been a movement on Capitol Hill, a lot of people saying, look, BP should stop paying dividends to its stockholders and start giving money to some of these people who have been damaged. Is this a way around that and a good idea?
I think this is a good idea, but I think both those ideas are worth us exploring. The fact of the matter is, I do not believe that BP can continue to pay big stock dividends, can continue to get these pay for these full-page ads, running a public relations campaign, while so many families, so many communities are being ruined. I think the focus must be on developing and putting resources into these communities and onto these families and onto these working men and women, and whatever way we can do that, by an independent third party agency or by the federal government working in tandem, BP, whatever way is what we ought to do. That's where the focus ought to be. I don't think that BP has sufficiently put a focus on these communities and on what's happening to the occupations of those working men and women whose families are going to be ruined as a result of this.
Congressman Clyburn, Congressman Pence, let me ask you to just stick with me for a minute. I want to take a quick break. There are questions around an unknown surprising win in South Carolina, and a leading Republican voice is calling for a truce on social issues and politics with Congressman Clyburn and Pence right after this.